It began with a scream, not the kind you hear in passing, not the kind that could be mistaken for laughter on a drunken night. No, this scream is raw, shredded from the lungs, the kind that rips through the air as though it carries death itself on its back. A rustle, then a choking noise. A low, guttural growl follows, animal-like, yet it doesn't sound like any animal you could name. Then a man's voice, muffled and panicked, pleading, moaning in pain. Another scream, louder this time, filled with terror. And then, suddenly, as if cutting through the chaos, his voice comes clear. "Stop it!" Then silence. That was the voicemail Henry McCabe left his wife at 2:28 a.m. on September 7, 2015. A message that has haunted her ever since. A message that no one has ever been able to explain. On the night of September 6th, Henry joined friends at a nightclub in Spring Lake Park. It wasn't unusual. He liked to unwind, maybe have a drink or two, dance, and escape the weight of his life for a few hours. The club was loud, bodies pressed against each other under neon lights, laughter spilling like smoke into the night. Witnesses remember Henry laughing that night, his tall frame weaving through the crowd, a drink in hand. But they also remember something else, a tension beneath his smile. He argued briefly with one of his friends, about money, some said. Others claim it was about where they would go after. Small things, petty things, but sometimes it's the smallest sparks that ignite the biggest fires. By closing time, Henry was noticeably drunk. His friends offered to drive him home, but something went wrong. One friend would later say Henry asked to be dropped off at a gas station. Another claimed they didn't want him in the car because he was acting strangely. At some point, Henry ended up without his wallet, without his keys, and most crucially, without his phone. Imagine that, past 2 a.m., alone in the dark Minnesota night. No money, no way to call a cab, just miles of quiet roads, shadows stretching across empty parking lots, and the hum of neon gas station lights. That's where Henry's night turned into a mystery no one has ever been able to solve. The last place anyone could confirm seeing Henry McCabe was a dimly lit gas station. The kind of place that feels unsettling even in broad daylight. Fluorescent bulbs buzzing overhead, a few vending machines humming, and a trash can overflowing near the pump. At 2 a.m., it looked less like a service stop and more like a stage set for something sinister. The friend who dropped him there said Henry insisted. He didn't want to go home yet, or maybe he didn't want to be in the car anymore. Accounts differ, and that single detail, whether Henry chose to be left there or was abandoned, still stirs debates to this day. The gas station clerk later claimed he never saw Henry walk inside. Security cameras, if they were working that night, offered no usable footage. It was as if Henry stepped out of the car and melted into the shadows. He had no wallet, no keys, no phone, just the clothes on his back and the weight of whatever thoughts were swirling in his mind. The neighborhood around the station wasn't dangerous, but it wasn't the kind of place you'd want to wander aimlessly at 2:30 in the morning either. Long stretches of road disappeared into wooded patches and residential streets. Street lamps flickered, leaving pockets of darkness that seemed to move closer when you weren't looking directly at them. Some witnesses later reported seeing a tall man walking along the road that night, weaving slightly as though disoriented. They couldn't say for sure it was Henry, but the timeline fit. Imagine him there, walking into the dark, the cool September air brushing against his skin, the sounds of the city fading until the only thing he could hear was the crunch of his shoes against gravel, and the occasional rush of a distant car passing by. But what happened after? One theory suggests he was trying to walk home. From the gas station, it was miles away, far too long a trek for a man without shoes sturdy enough for the journey, especially in his state. Another theory suggests someone picked him up, voluntarily or not. What's undeniable is that somewhere between the gas station and the next hour, Henry managed to borrow a phone. Investigators would later confirm that the haunting voicemail left at 2:28 a.m. was made from a borrowed phone. Not his own. But whose phone was it? To this day, that detail remains muddy. What matters is that the message he left wasn't the slurred ramblings of a drunk man. It wasn't a casual check-in. It was a recording of pure terror. And before that call ended, Henry McCabe stepped completely out of the world of the living and into the unsolved. At 2:28 a.m., the quiet of a Minnesota home was broken by a voicemail notification. Henry's wife, Corrine, was asleep miles away. She wouldn't listen to it until later, but when she did, it would change her life forever. The call begins innocently enough. There's static, the faint rustle of movement, like someone fumbling with the phone. Then Henry's voice, muffled, uncertain. But before he can form words, something interrupts. A scream, not a startled yelp, not drunken nonsense. A scream from deep within the body, like something or someone was pulling it out of him by force. Then another sound, low, animalistic, almost guttural. A growl. At first, it could be mistaken for bad reception, distortion on the line. But the longer you listen, the less it sounds mechanical, and the more it sounds alive. Henry's voice comes back, groaning, pleading, as if he's being dragged or struck. The noises rise and fall in waves. Shrieks, gasps, the unmistakable sound of pain. And then, clear as day, Henry shouts, "Stop it!" The words cut through the chaos like a blade. It's not a plea. It's a command, laced with fear and defiance. For a moment, the line goes quiet, except for heavy breathing. Then the growls return, louder, stranger, almost unearthly. For more than 2 minutes, the voicemail captures a symphony of terror, human, and something else. Something that investigators, audio analysts, even paranormal researchers have never been able to agree on. Finally, the sounds fade into silence. The line goes dead. When Corrine played it back later, she froze. Her husband's voice was unmistakable. But the rest, she couldn't explain it. No one could. She saved the message, replaying it again and again. Every time she did, the questions grew darker. Who was Henry with? What was happening to him in that moment? And most terrifying of all, what were those other sounds? The voicemail wasn't just evidence. It was a haunting, proof that something unspeakable had happened in those early hours of September 7th. And by the time the sun rose, Henry McCabe had vanished. By sunrise, September 7th no longer felt like an ordinary day. For Henry's wife, Corrine, the voicemail lingered like a shadow she couldn't escape. At first, she thought it must have been some drunken rambling, distorted by poor reception. But the more she replayed it, the less it sounded like a man under the influence, and the more it sounded like a man fighting for his life. She called his friends. None of them had seen him since the night before. They each told slightly different versions of the story. One said he had dropped Henry at a gas station because he was acting weird. Another claimed Henry asked to be left there. A third insisted he thought Henry had a ride home. But no one could explain why Henry didn't have his wallet, or his keys, or even his phone. Corrine contacted the police immediately. At first, they treated it like a routine missing person case. Adults disappear for a night. They sober up. They come back. But then she played them the voicemail. The room changed. Veteran dispatchers, men and women who had heard the worst humanity could offer through static-filled phone lines, fell silent. Some leaned closer, listening for clues. Others pulled back, unsettled by the growls that bled through the recording. The voicemail was logged as evidence. Investigators tried to trace it. They confirmed one detail. The call had not come from Henry's own phone. Someone had lent him or given him the device. But whose? That question would never be answered clearly. Meanwhile, family and friends organized searches. Flyers went up with Henry's smiling face. Missing, last seen September 7th, 2015. They combed wooded areas, riversides, and backroads. Volunteers walked miles, calling his name into the stillness of Minnesota nights. But there was no trace, no footprints, no belongings, no sightings. The voicemail spread beyond his immediate circle. Local news stations picked up the story. Reporters described it as disturbing and unsettling. When clips of the audio leaked online, people around the world began offering theories. Some swore they heard another voice in the background. Others claimed the growls were human, low, guttural commands spoken in anger. A few insisted they heard something not human at all. Every person who listened heard something different. And through it all, Karine kept her phone close, hoping, dreading, waiting for another call that never came. For the police, the case had shifted from missing person to mystery. The voicemail was undeniable. Henry hadn't simply walked away from his life. Something had happened that night. But what? That question, hanging heavy in the air, was about to lead investigators down a path filled with contradictions, strange silences, and theories that only deepened the mystery. Because if Henry wasn't alive, then the voicemail wasn't just evidence. It was a death rattle. Every unsolved case eventually becomes a battlefield of theories. Some grow from facts, others from whispers, guesses, or the desperate need to fill silence with explanation. Henry McCabe's disappearance was no exception. The voicemail was the anchor, the one piece of solid evidence. But it was also the most confusing. To investigators, the growls and screams defied logic. To Henry's family, they were proof of violence. To strangers on the internet, they were a puzzle begging to be solved. And so the theories began. The first and most obvious theory was that Henry had been murdered. Friends admitted he was drinking heavily that night. Arguments broke out about money, about responsibility, about things that should have stayed small but didn't. Some suspected one of his friends had left him in a vulnerable position on purpose. Others whispered that maybe someone he trusted turned on him. The voicemail seemed to support this. The plea, "Stop it," sounded like a man under attack. The animal-like growls could have been distorted voices, maybe a struggle caught by poor reception. But there were problems. When Henry's body was eventually recovered, there were no stab wounds, no bullet holes, no bruises consistent with a beating. He was simply gone, with nothing but water in his lungs. If it was murder, it was strangely clean. Others believed the truth was simpler. Henry, drunk and disoriented, wandered from the gas station and fell into the lake where he was later found. The voicemail? Just the sounds of a man stumbling, panicking, maybe hallucinating. But could a man drowning make those kinds of sounds? Analysts debated it. Some said yes. Gasping, flailing, the primal panic of suffocation might explain the screams. But the growls? The clarity of "stop it"? Those didn't fit so neatly. And if he had drowned that night, why did it take weeks to find his body? When the lake had been searched early on, a darker possibility lingered. Henry had been assaulted, maybe even tortured, in ways that left no obvious injuries. Water was a perfect cover. A drowning could wash away evidence, obscure timelines. Some even suspected his body had been moved, placed in the lake later, after initial searches turned up nothing. But without proof, it remained speculation. Then came the theory most people dismissed, yet couldn't ignore. The sounds on the voicemail were wrong. Audio specialists tried to explain the growls, the distorted tones, but many admitted they'd never heard anything quite like it. Paranormal investigators took it further. They claimed the sounds were non-human, perhaps even demonic. Online, the voicemail was dissected endlessly, slowed down, filtered, enhanced. Some claimed to hear voices whispering commands. Others swore they heard something like laughter buried in the distortion. One chilling interpretation surfaced, that Henry wasn't alone in that recording, and that whatever was with him wasn't human. Theories piled up, but none could bridge the gap between evidence and answers. Henry was alive when he made that call. He was terrified. He was begging for something to stop. And yet, when his body was found, it told no story of violence. The voicemail remained the only witness. And like most witnesses in unsolved cases, it refused to tell the whole truth.